the Friday Mind Emission on the Toad Cam in New York, Toad City, and the problems of consciousness, how the problems of consciousness showing up. That's when I hear that term, I get a little bit of hair standing up on the end of the back of my neck, because I know something about the genealogy of that idea of showing up. But Martin Heidegger is very, very fond of it. Philosophy, consciousness. I remember I was out in one of those places you go on, these dreary business trips out into sort of the flyover country out there in the Midwest someplace. I hope if you're in the Midwest you're not offended by this. And I was with some Russian mathematicians, and we were hanging out in the local Ohio, the one restaurant that I think everybody in town went and had lunch at this restaurant. And because our conversation tended to be pretty unlike all the other conversations around, it seemed like at a certain moment that everybody in the restaurant was kind of listening in on what we were saying. And I started talking about the idealist idea that the world is an idea. The world is something that's mostly in your head. You don't know the world except by what's in your head. The brain is generating at every moment sort of an idea of how the world is, but we don't really know how the world is other than this idea or measurements that we take at a distance, which still have to get filtered through this idea of consciousness. And the room started getting quieter and quieter and quieter. It is quite a large room, it's a very big place. And I was surprised that everybody in this freaking restaurant appeared to have slowly ended their conversation so they could listen in on what we were saying. We must have sounded like we were from Mars. You can imagine these Russians, mathematicians, consciousness stuff. And these people are talking about stuff like tires and wallboard and floor tile glue and stuff like that. But I was very struck by how curious they were, how intensely curious everybody was. They were so curious that they basically all just sort of mutually agreed to leave whatever trance they were in and enter our trance and pick up on what we were saying. It must have been very fascinating to them. And I was surprised, that people would actually sort of allow us to provide them with some of our understanding. So I remember, when I finally brought the point up that the color red only existed in our minds. There was no red in the world. The world is not, there's nothing red in nature. Red is a hallucination. It's a very precise hallucination that we're assigning value to a certain energy state of photons. But the photons aren't, quote, red or blue or green. They're just photons that are operating in some kind of string thing is just wiggling at a certain frequency, and that our brain picks up on that wiggle and says, oh, stuff that wiggles like that, we'll call that red. All right. Place went dead silent. I mean, you could hear I think they even stopped eating. I didn't even hear silverware touching the plate. They were so astounded by this that people were discussing this in the middle of Podunk, Ohio. I think they would have been even more astounded if I had brought up the idea that time doesn't exist. Something is happening, and this is one of those great mysteries that we label time, that the brain labels time, but we're really only in a very precise moment. And how that turns into time is probably one of the greatest mysteries of both physics, being, it's one of those like super questions. So I don't know how that happens, but time is represented in our minds by memory. So the time, dogs have a certain kind of time. Dogs have a certain sense of time, which is a much, much briefer moment of time. Dogs don't really have a much distant past, although they do have memory, long-term memory, which sort of links them to a more distant past, but not quite like humans do, I don't think. And I don't think dogs have a very much projection into the future, which you might say is forward memory, using imagining what things may be like in the future, projecting or predicting, so very predictive thinking. And I think probably animals have more going on the past memory side and a little bit of prediction into the future, maybe if they're hunting or gathering or something like that. But humans seem to have this extraordinary capacity to generate imaginative futures and extraordinary capacity to generate a sense of the past or the sense of history. And of course that that past is for different people is radically different. So anyone who's seen those classic stories like Rashomon that Kurosawa did, that show people remembering the past in ways where certain facts are shared and other narratives or storylines are completely different depending on the biases and the ego of the person remembering it. I think I also did bring up Vital Lies, Simple Truths, which is a psychology of self-deception. And if you want to dig into the idea of the defense mechanisms and how people manipulate their sense of reality, people manipulate their sense of responsibility through altering the story, sometimes in very extreme ways. And modern psychology is really looking a whole lot more about the reliability of memory. People that are eyewitnesses to crime sometimes are very, very unreliable witnesses, and people have been convicted on the basis of eyewitness testimony that turned out to be basically eyewitness fantasy. So the idea of time itself, where we fit in it, and that whole sort of river of time that we are in is, just like the color red, another one of the very sophisticated reality generations, or very sophisticated adaptive hallucinations that the brain generates. So it's very important for us to realize that so much of what we think is the real, is the real is the active functioning of the brain generating an inner set of an inner sort of set of movies that we then call how it was, the real. And out of that also has come, I think, some kind of perverse thinkings, like in The Secret, which I often find quite appalling, which is simply by thinking something hard enough, by fantasizing something hard enough, without really having to go out and do something physically proactive in the world, just by creating the image that somehow the world will then change around and conform to what's in our head. The very, very strange piece of psychology when you think about it. When the previous idea was that we took the world in, we tried to make a best estimate of what reality was, and the sanest and the best grounded of us had basically a fairly accurate model of what was going on out there in certain senses. This turned that on its head. It said that if you modified the model, if basically you utilized fantasy processes just by becoming a better fantasist, you could then create the outer world. Now, I think there's a degree of truth to that, all right? A degree of truth. And that degree of truth, though, has been expanded into like this entire The Secret doctrine, which I don't think is true. I think it's a dangerous form of unreality if it's taken too far. So anyway, that's going to be my little wrap up and summation for where we're at here on Friday.